Hello everyone, my name is Barbara and I would like to welcome you all to our latest Novedge Webinar episode. In this week's episode, a look into the new Maxwell Render V3.1. Take a detailed look at the new cool features in Maxwell Render Suite V3, a free upgrade to V3 users. We will demo features such as the new spotlight emitter with precise controls, OpenVDB support, the new white balance tool, and a few other improvements and features which will help you make your workflow more efficient. Today's presenter, Mihai Iliuta, has been a dedicated Maxwell Render user since the very first alpha releases in 2004. For the past few years, he has been working for Next Limit Technologies, providing technical support and overseeing the beta testing of Maxwell Render releases. Before we get going, here's an overview of what we do at Novedge. Novedge is one of the largest online stores for design software. We offer a huge assortment of software solutions that cater to virtually every designer's need. Put us to the test and come visit our webpage at novedge.com. And as you can see, there's 25% off on Maxwell Render till December 19th, so take advantage. For more daily software news and limited time promotions, pay a visit to the Novedge blog and follow us on Facebook, Google+, and Twitter. Coming up next week, killer rendering tips for V-Ray and Rhino. Dave Schultz will deliver a series of short and sweet personal tips, tricks, and date hacks. The focus will be on the new features in V-Ray, but also cover things that have been around in both Rhino and V-Ray that many people have overlooked. Last but not least, today's webinar is free and is being recorded live. If you want to watch this or any webinar episode in our collection, just head over onto Novedge on YouTube and Vimeo. And now, it's time for me to make Mihai the presenter, and so you can share his screen. Let's see. You should see Mihai's screens any seconds now. Here we go. All right. Mihai, the stage is all yours. I'll talk to you at the end. Good luck.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Barbara, for that nice introduction. So hi everybody, and welcome to this brief introduction to all the new stuff we've added to 3.1. So we have about an hour, and I'll try to show you a little bit how the new stuff works and the cool things it allows you to do. So first of all, I'd like to mention this. It's not a new feature, but as always, the point releases for Maxwell are completely free. So if you already have version 3, it's completely free for you. And these are some of the things, the main features we've added in this 0.1 release. So I'm going to go through these things. And there are a couple of other small improvements, and you can see them when the release is live. You'll be able to see those in our documentation pages. You can see the full release notes to get all the details. But I'm going to go through this stuff today. So first of all, spotlight emitter. It's a long time since we needed to add this, and lots of people have asked us to add some sort of lighting control so you can control exactly where the light falls, the fall off, and things like that. So let me just show you that first of all. So here in Studio, again, I'm showing you this in Studio since it's a general application for Maxwell, but the parameters for the spotlights are going to be identical in all of the plugins, so you don't have to worry. It's not a Studio specific thing. So then, in this simple scene, I have the usual emitter plane, which you're probably familiar with now, and you can see that it's very difficult to control exactly where this light is going to fall, right? Usually what you had to do is actually model a cylinder and put this emitter inside it, so you get sort of like a nicer fall off, a more controlled lighting. So what you have to do now simply to switch this regular plane emitter into a spot emitter is actually go into the emitter settings, and from the area emitter, so the area emitter is actually the old emitter that we used to have. You just have to switch it to spot, and that's it. Okay, and now you can see that we get a nice spot looking light, which you can control very easily. And the main controls are the cone angle. So this controls basically how wide this beam of light is or how narrow it is. Alright, so that's pretty straightforward. The fall-off angle controls actually the fall-off angle here from the full brightness all the way to the darkness here. So for example, if I set it to 1, okay, now you can see that that fall-off is very sharp, and you do have spotlights that can actually have such a sharp fall-off, or you can make something in between, or you can also go, you know, very, very wide on that fall-off. You have lots of control, instant control with these spotlights. Let's see, set it back to 10. And also, for extra added control, you have this parameter called the fall-off type, which actually controls the look of this fall-off. So by default it's linear. It's a very linear fall-off from light to full light, from full light to full darkness. But you can also control that look. For example, instead of linear, you can change it to square root. And now you can see how that has changed the fall-off, that it's much more abrupt. It suddenly gets completely dark compared to linear. And you have a few more looks, you know, just for really fine-tuning the look of your spotlights. Okay, and finally you have a blur parameter, which usually works together with a projection texture, which I'm going to show you in a second. But you can actually also use it if you don't use a projection texture, just to slightly blur the shadows from the spotlight. So for example, if I set this to like 25 or even more, you can see now that you also have some control over how sharp the shadows are from these spotlights. And one thing to remember is that as usual, you have to apply an emitter material to some real geometry, but when you switch it to spot, the actual geometry of that emitter doesn't matter anymore, okay? Because behind the scenes there, it takes over that geometry, so it doesn't matter. This could be a teapot or an elephant, it doesn't matter. And you can also scale this plane up, it doesn't matter either. So when it's in spotlight mode, only these parameters control the look of the light. Just keep that in mind. Okay, so just to make this a little bit more interesting, I'm just going to show you a little bit more cool stuff you can do, especially with textures and projections. So here I have two emitters, actually three, set to spotlight. Switch those two off, so I only have this one from the left. Okay, and then I have a backdrop emitter, which is only supposed to give a nice little background light. And to that emitter, to that spotlight, I've added a texture to be projected, much like a slide projector. So I just added this this image here, and it's being projected through the through that spotlight onto the background. So now this blur parameter matters a lot when you use projection textures, because you can make it very sharp, like this for example, and just make it brighter. Okay, so now I can see that texture very sharply. It's just like a movie projector. So that's pretty cool by itself. Or you can make it as blurry as you want. Alright, so that's pretty easy to control with the blur parameter. Also, of course, instead of just bitmaps, you can also use procedural textures. And that can be very nice. So you can use these as gobos or go-betweens to add interesting patterns to lighting patterns to your scenes. Okay, so that's the projection textures. Both bitmaps and all the procedural textures can be used as projection textures. And finally, on the emitter from the right here, I just solo that. For this one, I just try to mimic, you know, those film noir looks where where they put an extra sharp light on the character's eyes. And for that, I just created a simple black and white texture in Photoshop and loaded that as my gobo, so to speak. So it just gives you that very, very thin slice of light. So that's all you have to do to get that effect. And then I slightly blurred it because otherwise it would be maybe a little bit too sharp. Okay, and when you combine those, it gives a really nice effect. So hopefully you can see that it's very, very easy to set this up with the spotlight emitters and how much control you now have to control exactly where your light is going to fall. Right, so that's about spotlight emitters. Next, what do we have on the list? Okay, so the white balance tint controls. This is pretty interesting because usually you would think that you can do the white balance in post, especially if you, let's say you save an image in 32-bit or even 16-bit and do the white balance in post. But the cool thing about doing it directly in Maxwell is actually that when you try to do white balance, the interesting thing is not the bit depth, it's actually the color gamut that's stored in that file that you saved. And Maxwell works in the full visible light spectrum, okay, which is this shoe, horseshoe shaped here. And you can see that even if you would save an image using ProPhoto RGB, which has a very wide color gamut, it's still not as wide as Maxwell's native color space. So that's why it's a good idea to have this tool directly inside of Maxwell. And you have two controls, both for the white point, which is actually the color temperature, and also the tint. You need these two parameters to have an accurate white balance because one of them controls the color temperature goes from yellow to blue, that's one axis, and then you have the tint that goes from green to magenta. So you need both those axes to control to get an accurate white balance, so to speak. So just to show you this quickly, this is a quick test render that's not yet finished, but just to give you an idea of how these two controls work. So it's the white point and a tint, and they're under the tone mapping section in the camera panel. Okay, so simply here, because I used emitters that are by default, Maxwell uses 6500K, it's perfectly white balanced, all right? But let's say you had a physical sky render and you want to white balance that with emitters, you can now much more easily do that by just changing the white point parameter. Just turn off the scattering. Okay, so you can see, and also of course you don't only need this for accurate white balancing, you can also use it for artistic purposes. So here, as I'm turning it here, it's going more towards blue at a lower temperature, and as I increase the temperature, so here I'm specifying what were my emitter temperatures in the scene. So if my emitters were 7364K, then this would be perfectly white balanced, but now I'm going too much compared to the 6500K, so it gets a little bit more yellow. Okay, and again with the tint you control the greens and the magentas, so you can get some pretty interesting colors from that as well. Right here I'm adding lots of lots of green, too much green. Okay, so that's quickly the white balance tool, and just to give you an example of why this wouldn't work so well in doing this in post. For example, I think I rendered this. Let's see. So this is a scene with a color checker, and it's being illuminated by a 3000K emitter, so it's a pretty yellowish emitter. And let's see if I save this. I already rendered this. Yeah. If I open these two files, okay, so one was rendered in Maxwell, and the white balance was done in Maxwell. And this is the render. Let me render this. And this is the render you would get with this 3K emitter saved if you saved a render. All right, and you open it in Photoshop. And then usually what you would do to white balance this in Photoshop is you would use the curves tool, and you would choose your black point, your white point, and then maybe some middle gray, right? And then it looks like something, you know, it looks a lot better than before. It's color balanced in a way, but if you look carefully, some of the colors are a bit screwed up, especially the grays. They don't really look gray, they look a little bit pinkish. Compare that to doing the white balance in Maxwell, which I would simply just change the white point to the white point of my emitter, and that's it. And now it's properly white balanced. And if I compare those two, you can see that this one in Maxwell, if I just increase the contrast to make them match a little better. Here in Maxwell you get much nicer grays, much nicer skin tones, for example. These ones look a little bit weird now, especially the grays compared to doing the white balance in Maxwell. And this is entirely up to the color gamut thing. Okay, so that's why it's a huge advantage to do this directly inside of Maxwell, to have this tool. Finally, just to mention about the tone mapping, the new tone mapping tools we have also. So these are found under the camera response, also in the camera panel. So by default, as you may know, Maxwell renders in a linear space, so the tone mapping is completely linear. That's why usually when you save a render from Maxwell, you have to do a little bit of post to the render, especially to add some contrast to it, because it's a very linear tone mapping. So here you can have a few presets you can quickly use, which are of different film responses, film curves. So that can give you a little bit, let's see, well, this is going to look too, yeah, this is a little bit too extreme. This one, for example. Okay, so you can see that it changes the color response a little bit, and also it usually adds a little bit of contrast compared to this one, which is Maxwell's default response. Okay, so those can be pretty useful to give you an instant film look to your renders. That's one. That's a little bit too exaggerated. Let's try this one. Compared to doing that in post, and it just saves you a little bit of time, really, in post. Okay, so that's the new tone mapping response curves 3.1. Right, so moving on. One cool feature which people have also asked us a lot is the ability to continue rendering, but only a portion of your render. Okay, so for example, let's say you have your entire scene is pretty much clean, but in one tiny part of it you have a material or you have an object that's still pretty noisy, and you want to somehow mask that and tell Max, okay, just concentrate on that area and don't render the rest of it. Okay, and as a result, sometimes you can get actually faster renders using this extra sampling feature, and you can choose that mask either by the custom alpha in your scene or a bitmap, actually a black and white bitmap, which you can create in Photoshop and load it, or the main alpha channel of your render. I'm going to show you that in a minute. And just please keep in mind that in many cases this can be very useful, but it's not like a magic solution. Okay, you're not going to suddenly get 50 times faster rendering just because you're rendering a tiny part of your render. Why is this? Because Maxwell still has to keep in mind somehow the entire lighting in the scene. Okay, so if you have an emitter which is very far away and to the left of your scene, which the camera doesn't see, Maxwell still has to evaluate the rays of light that comes from that emitter, even if it's not visible in your scene. And so it's a little bit more complicated than just simply, you know, adding a mask and telling Max, okay, just render this part, because the lighting is just, it influences the entire scene usually. But in many cases you'll see a speed up of your render, especially if you have an area which has a lot of noise compared to the. See a little bit how that works. I'm just gonna use this Nespresso machine to show you. So in this case, let's say that, you know, most of the scene looks okay, except that this red material is much more noisier than the rest, and you don't want to render the whole scene up to sampling level 20. But by sampling level 14, let's say most of it is clean except this red material. So how can I create a mask to just render this red material? So that's very easy. You go to the render options, and here under custom alpha, I check custom alpha, and then I press set alphas, and I create a custom alpha channel. So let's say this is my red material. And here I can choose not just an object, but now in 3.1 I can also choose a material that will create this alpha. So I press here to get a list of the materials in the scene, and I choose the red metal material. So now I've created that custom alpha. And next, up here under extra sampling, now I can enable this. And as my mask, as I mentioned, I can either use a bitmap, which I can load here. I can use the main alpha channel of the render, which will be this channel here, or I can use a custom alpha, either by an object or by a material. So here, since I only have one custom alpha channel, it's automatically selected it. Remember, it's the red material one, which I created here. Okay, and now all I have to do is tell Maxwell, okay, render the entire scene up to sampling level 14, and then continue with the red metal material up to, let's say, sampling level 20. Okay, and that's all you have to do. For demonstration purposes, and also because I have a pretty slow computer and it's also recording at the same time, I'm just going to do a, let's say, it's going to render the whole thing up to sampling level 5, and then continue to sampling level 10 for the red material. So you can see what happens. And also I get my custom alpha channel of the red material. Okay, so now it's gone up to sampling level 3, sampling level 4, and sampling level 5. Okay, so now it's stopped the entire render except this red material now, which continues on. until sampling level 10. Okay, and you can see it's quite fast to render just that red material in this case because we don't have many caustics. The lighting is pretty simple, so Maxwell can really concentrate just on this small area here. And then we get an indication here telling us that the extra sampling went on up to sampling level 10, and then it's telling you that combined you've reached an average sampling level of almost 6. But you can tell that the red material is much cleaner than the rest of the render in this case. Okay, so that's pretty much it about the extra sampling option. And again, this will be available in all the plugins. It's not a thing exclusive to Studio. Right. So then moving on. Right, this is a cool thing for you VFX guys. I'm not sure how much it will matter for the architects or the product industrial designers, but at least, well, you can also create clouds and smoke effects, things like that. That can be very useful in many cases. So for you that don't know, what is OpenVDB? Well, it's basically a very efficient format to store massive simulations, massive particle simulations. So what it does is, instead of storing in the file each individual particle, which, let's say for huge volcanic explosion, you would need billions and billions of particles, and that file would be just huge, immense. Instead, it just saves voxels, so it's like 3D pixels of that simulation, and it can store that much more efficiently than just storing individual particles in the file. So it allows you to have very detailed smoke simulations or explosion simulations without hugely massive files. And the nice thing in Maxwell is that it works really by default, so to speak, with all your lights in the scene. There's nothing special you need to do about the shaders. There's nothing special you need to do about your lights and so on. It just reacts naturally with any emitter in your scene. So, you know, geometry emitters, environment lighting, HDR lighting, all of that. And also you can apply any material to these volumetric VDB files. And actually in most cases you're going to see that to mimic a smoke look, then it's enough to just use a simple Lambert material. So let me just load up a scene to show you that quickly. Just close some of this stuff. So here I'm using the usual Maxwell volumetric extension object. So to do that, you just simply right-click in the object list and choose Create Extension Object, Maxwell Volumetric. That's as usual as in version 3. The new thing is that now we've added this VDB volume file based type in the field type. So you have to use this one and then load a VDB file. And that's it basically. And in this case I'm using a example file from the OpenVDB site. So it's openvdb.org. Okay. And here in the download section you have some test files you can play with. It's this one. I'm going to render in Maxwell, and you have some other cool smoke files, even the famous bunny made into into smoke if you wanna play with that. Otherwise, the main applications that can create these VDB files are mostly geared toward VFX. So Maya can do that natively via the fluid simulator it has. Houdini is very good at it. You also have a few smoke plugins for 3D Max that can save VDB files, and also, of course, NextLimit's RealFlow can export VDB files, so you can also create, you know, tornadoes and stuff like that in RealFlow and export that as VDB file and render it with Maxwell, which is pretty nice. So here I've loaded that file, the VDB file, And the main parameters for this VDB field, so you can ignore all this extra stuff here. When you set it to volume-based file, we're only interested in this section here, VDB field. The first parameter you have to care about is this one, the base grid. So what is that and why do you need to specify it? It's because these VDB files, they always have a base grid, which is usually the main voxels in that file which describe the density of that smoke simulation, okay? And usually in 90% of cases, that grid name will be density. If you don't specify a grid name here, then Maxwell is just going to analyze that VDB file and load the first grid that it finds. But usually, in more than 90% of the cases, the first grid mentioned in that file is the density grid. And that depends on the application that saved that file. So let's see what you can do to find out the name of that grid. To do that, you just click render. So I added the file, I click render, and I don't know what the grid name is. To find that out, you go into the console, and here where it says loading geometry extensions, Maxwell is going to tell you all the grid names that it found in that file. So here we can see that this particular file contains 3 grids. The first one is density, so it automatically used that to render because we didn't specify one. Then you have a temperature grid. So this is usually a numeric type grid that specifies the temperature resulting from that simulation. So the software that created that simulation also specified the temperature in the file at different parts of the smoke simulation. And you also have a third grid, which is V, which I think in this case stands for velocity. So some of these particles in the file moved faster than others. And you can actually map a texture to these different grids so that, for example, the fastest moving particles are blue and the slower particles are yellow, and so on. And you can do the same with the temperature. I'm going to show you that in a second, how you can UV map these grids. But anyway, so to find out the grid names, just do a quick test render and Maxwell is going to tell you that. So in this case, we can either just write ourselves here density, but it's not necessary because Maxwell will just grab that first density file. And here, if we want to map, let's say I want to map the temperature with a texture, I have to specify that I want Maxwell to use that extra grid. So I'm going to write here the name of the grid, temperature. And also I can use the second grid V here if I want. I can also map that to a different texture. So I specify that via a comma, all right, all the grids that I want to use. But in this case, we're just going to use temperature. And the next thing we have to look for is what type of data does this store. And we can see that it stores a floating type data. What this basically means is that you can have 2 types of data that Maxwell can interpret. One is a float, which is basically a numeric type of data. The other is a vector. Okay, so velocity is usually stored in vector. Okay, you don't really have to think too much what those mean. It's just a way of storing the data. So a temperature, because it's numeric, it makes sense, is stored as a float, and the velocity, because it describes a direction and a speed, it's stored as a vector. It's important to know that because we have to build the UVs from these grids, and we have to know what type they are in order to build the UVs to use for that texturing. So the next thing you have to do is create a UV set for this volumetric, and as the type, because we want to use the temperature, you have to set it to one of these here, a float, because it was a float type. And you can see that you have actually 10 channels or 10 UV channels for each of the vectors or the floats. So you can actually map in all 20 different textures, if you would like to this cloud with the simulation. So here I'm just going to choose the first one because I only have one floating grid or float grid. And next I'm going to use a texture. Let's see if I had a I just have a simple gradient. Where is that? Well, I can just quickly create it in Photoshop. Let's see. So I'm just going to do a gradient from, okay, let's say from red to green. And I'll save that as a regular bitmap. Okay, and then I've specified here the texture in my material. And I'm leaving this at channel 0 because I'm not using any other textures, and this is also at channel 0. And hopefully we should see something now. Okay, so we see that it's mapping something, it's mapping the temperature, but the actual range is wrong. So if we do another test render, actually I'm just going to load this window again. We can see that this temperature grid, or sorry, we have to do a test render again to find out the range of this temperature grid. Okay, so once you use the grid, it's going to tell you here the min values and the max values. Okay, and we have to specify those in the float grid here that we're using to have a more accurate range. I think that should be the temperature. So I'm using here the first channel, the first float channel, because that's the channel that it's using here. It's the first float channel that's found in the file, so that's why I'm using this. I think we changed the range to something smaller. Let's see. Oh, right, I have to delete this one because I was using that one. Let's see. There we go. Let me just set this to you. So usually you set the range to the range that's specified in the grid itself here. So the values you can find out here by just doing a test render again, the min values and the max values for that particular grid. And since it's the first floating grid that's found in the file, that's why I'm using the first floating parameter here. If it was a vector, then I would use the first vector parameter here. Okay, so let's see what happens if we get a little bit of green. So to get a bit more green, we can compress this range so we can make it a little bit smaller. Maybe even more than that. Eventually, maybe the temperature, well, there's not much difference in this file perhaps, but you can start to see a little bit of green. In the render. Yeah, it is a little bit confusing. We have a good documentation page for this. Let's see, maybe the range has to be the other way around. No, it's supposed to be smaller. Anyway, this is a beta, but this is how it's supposed to work. So anyway, I hope you get an idea of how you're supposed to use the additional grids for UVs. Okay, so to wrap that up, yeah, I'm seeing a little bit green here at the slowly moving out from inside the cloud. So basically you have to find out what type of grid is it that you want to use for UVs. Is it a vector grid, which usually specifies the speed or velocity, or is it some other grid that's numeric, and that way it's going to be float. Okay, it's going to be a float type grid. And then you have to create either a float UV set or a vector UV set, depending on the grid that you're using, and then to specify the range that's found in the file, you specify the ranges here. So the first floating grid for the second floating grid that the file may have, and so on, and the same for the vector grids. And you can play around with the ranges to sort of compress or expand how that texture is going to be mapped, or that gradient is going to be mapped to that range. Okay. So those are the grids. Well, the last important parameter here is the base grid multiplier. So what that does is actually make the cloud more or less dense. So if you use a very small density, you get a more normal looking cloud, I guess, which would be smoke. And if you raise it a lot, it makes your smoke cloud a lot denser, which can be interesting. Like you can do, for example, underwater ink in water simulations. Then you would probably need to use a higher grid multiplier. I think I have 2 test renders to show you what that looks like. So this is with 2000, and this is with the default of 10. So you can see what that looks like. And you can see that the lighting here, I have 4 emitters, one to the left, one at top, one at right here. You can see that it reacts very nicely with the lighting in the scene all by itself. And this again is just a regular Lambert material applied to this explosion VDB. Okay, well, I think we spent quite a lot of time on that, but yeah, it's a bit complex, but what isn't complex when it comes to VFX? So moving on, this is a very nice feature, again, the custom alpha per material. So if you know version 3, you know that we added a custom alpha that you can choose any object in your scene and specify that as a custom alpha. Well, now we've also added the ability to do that per material. So the way you do that is very simple. It's from the same place here, which you can find here in the custom alphas. And so you check it, you set alpha, and here you create a material, let's say black plastic. right? And you select it, and instead of choosing an object, you can now choose a material or several materials if you want from your list. Okay, and close that. And now when you go to render, you can see now we've created a custom alpha based on those materials in that custom alpha channel. Okay, and of course this is not limited to just one custom alpha channel. You can have several of them. So here I click set alphas again. I can choose another one. So let's say this is red, and for this red one, let's say I want to add the red metal material, and I can choose a third one, which is say glass objects. So it doesn't matter what name you give them, they can have any name. And here instead of materials I can choose objects, so I can choose a reservoir that can be made of glass. Okay, so now I have 3 custom alphas, and just keep in mind that when you render it in Maxwell, it's just going to show you the first alpha channel, but don't worry, it's actually saving all of those extra custom alpha channels to disk. It's just for display purposes. It shows you the first channel in your alphas list. Okay, so that's custom alpha per material, and like you saw with the render zones, it's really useful because you can use also the materials or the custom alphas. You can use those for the extra sampling here. Okay, moving on. Just have a short drink. That's Coke, by the way, don't get any ideas. Turntable animations, this is a pretty nifty tool which is found in Studio, so it allows you to do very quick presentation type animations. So this is very nice for you industrial designers. You can have your object animated in a turntable animation, or you can animate the camera. You can even animate the environment lighting. So for example, you can do a morning to daytime time-lapse animation of your building using this tool. And it also supports motion blur, so when you move an object or you move the camera, you're automatically going to get motion blur if you want that. So you can find this tool in Studio up here for the animation, and it brings up this dialog. And well, the controls are pretty straightforward, so you can animate the camera, and then you can check that you have some options, which direction it should go, if it should ease in, ease out, if it should do the motion blur or not, or animate any object in your scene. And the environment again. So you can, if you have an IBL, you can rotate that IBL, that HDR map, and also animate the sun. So you can do the beginning and the end, if you forwards or backwards. So that's pretty cool to do these day to night time-lapse animations now very easily without you having to buy, you know, an animation package for these simple type of animations. So just to show you quickly an example here, so this is done with this tool. Okay, so this is the motorcycle itself animated with this tool, and you can see that it also has motion blur on it. Okay, so that's very easy, very straightforward to use. Next, the floating shadows and reflections. This is another easy to use presentation tool when you don't want to go through Photoshop to composite stuff and things like that, and you just want to show somebody very quickly a render with shadows on a nice white backdrop or any IBL backdrop. And it works only in Fire, so keep that in mind, i.e. draft to rendering mode. and it's available in Studio. So you can load any backdrop, including a solid color, by using the IBL lighting and loading a bitmap, an EXR. So basically you have to convert any bitmap you converted first in Photoshop to an EXR, and you load that in the background slot. So just to show you that quickly, so let's say I want to use a white backdrop. I can just use a very tiny white texture. I change the mode to 32 bits so I can save it as an EXR, and then I just save it as an EXR, and let me just hide the backdrop. I set the environment lighting to image based, and here in my background I'm going to load that white EXR. Let me see if I can find it. Oops. Stuff can happen. Let's try that again. So IBL. I think it's saved correctly. Wait. See where that is. This is pretty interesting. Well, it's live, everything happened. It worked a minute ago. I think maybe the file is too small. I'll just try and save it one again. So save as white to EXR. Anyway, it's probably a small bug. Let me see. No, it doesn't want to now, but anyway, let me show you this with any backdrop then. So I'm going to hide the backdrop, switch on fire, and let's just use the sky for this. And just change the, there we go, the exposure settings for the camera. And so to turn this on, it's also from the render options. You have a new section here called fire, and you can simply turn on floating shadows. And actually I have the emitters in there. Let me switch those off. And the sun. So you need an actual emitter in the scene to get shadows, either an emitter or the sun. You can see that those shadows are now superimposed in the preview render, and also the reflections, I can turn those on. Okay, so again, this is not something limited to this little window here. You can switch your render options to draft, and you can render a nice big render using fire and these shadows here. So again, once we fix that small bug with the background IBL, you can also load any color backdrop, and you can have very quick renders this way with nice shadows superimposed on a white backdrop or any color backdrop. All right. So moving on, quickly running out of time. Let's see, the last thing. This is very useful. So we've added hide from camera in shadow channel. So this really enables you to render a so-called full shadow pass without having to render twice. So to explain to you a little bit of the problem this is trying to solve, let me load another example here. So before we added this, if you wanted to have a shadow channel render, so let's say we specify in the channels here that I wanted to create a render which is this coffee machine on a white background with a shadow for my emitter. What you have to do is, first of all, in the backdrop material, or the backdrop object here, I wanted to act as a shadow catcher. So for the backdrop, I would have to turn on, in the material applied to it, I would have to turn on in the global properties the shadow here, and then in the render options, I would have to turn on the shadow channel. Okay, and that's it. Basically, now I've turned this backdrop into a so-called shadow catcher, and if I rendered that, you can see that now my backdrop is catching those shadows, and I have my main render. Actually, I forgot to also hide the backdrop. I hide it to the camera so that then I also get my alpha channel. And click here and render that. Okay, so now basically I have three files. I have my main render file, and it's cut out because I'm using an alpha, and then I have my shadow channel render. I had to take those three files and composite them in Photoshop. So I think I rendered those already, so we go a little bit faster. Actually, let me load them. Okay, so this is the old way of working. The quickest way was actually, if you were working with alpha channel, switch this from separate to embedded, and that way when you save a PNG, and the PNGs can have support transparency, unlike JPEGs, then you would automatically get a render that's already cut out, so you get this transparent background. And then the procedure would be that I would open up my shadow render, I copied it into my main render, move it below it, and then I create a solid color, let's say red, and I move that also below it, and then I will switch the shadow channel render to multiply. Okay, and now I have my backdrop and my shadow here. But if you look very carefully, the problem here is that when you had objects that are touching the ground like this, or well, not only when you're touching the ground, but in many cases when you have a high contrast area here and you had a shadow channel, because that shadow channel was cut out, okay, so it's the objects here in the shadow channel are occluding the shadow, you would get this little tiny artifact here, this line that's, you can see that it's a little bit brighter than the rest of the shadow, and that looks pretty bad, especially if you print this at a high resolution. And you can't really solve this without actually rendering twice. Okay, so what you would have to do is, now you would have your main render, and then what you would have to do is hide all the other objects to camera, okay, and then do only a shadow pass render so that you would get the full shadow channel. And I have a page here that shows you what a full shadow channel is, so that you would get this type of shadow channel. Okay, but now you can simply do that without having to render twice by just selecting all these objects and set them to hide camera in shadow channel. Okay, and then you would get a full shadow channel and you would not have this problem of this little line here. Okay, and you can get that from the same render. You don't have to render twice again. I think I'm not sure if I rendered an example of that, but you get the idea. So you get a full shadow channel, not a clip one, from the same render now, just by using this option here for all the objects that you want to hide in the shadow channel. Actually, let me just show you that. Okay, so now you can see that I'm getting this full shadow channel, and I just simply load that as usual in Photoshop, and I don't get this with the exact same procedure, except I won't get this this line here because it's not clipped out. It's a full shadow channel. All right, that's it, I think. And yeah, it's exactly, wow, it's exactly 1 hour. I've been talking to myself, it seems. It's very quiet out there. Okay, Barbara, I think
we're all
I'm
here.
finished.
Yes, so we're all here. I'm going to send you a couple of questions. Now we were all listening. I'm going to send you one question and I'll read it to you as well. Does Maxwell support OpenCL GPU like D700 on the new Mac Pro?
No, for now if you read our new blog, so it's blog.maxwellrender.com, you can see that we have some information about the upcoming prototype, so to speak, of Maxwell running on the GPU. But for now in 3.1 it doesn't utilize the GPU to do the actual rendering. The only thing it's going to use the GPU now is for the fast multi-light feature that we added in version 3, which actually means that it uses the GPU now. So you can see that when I'm doing the multi-light adjustments, it's real time now in the main render view, and that uses the GPU, but not for the actual rendering itself.
Another question is this one. When will you support CUDA?
Well, it's the same question actually. It's about the GPU rendering.
Okay.
So that's
never mind. Okay. So sorry about that. So there's somebody very enthusiastic about the color checker, and he's asking if he sends you his email, if you could get the color checker to him.
Sure, no problem. But let me just check because I think it's actually part of the install, if I'm not mistaken. Let me just color checker. Yeah, it's part of the install.
Great then, even better.
So it's actually found in the install folder. So it's your Maxwell 3 folder. Then go to Library Objects.
Excellent.
That's where you find it, and it's called Color Checker _classic.
Great. So the last question, where can I find tutorials for new users of Maxwell Studio?
Well, the best channels would be to check out our Vimeo and YouTube channels. So we have a few video tutorials there. There are also series done by other users, and I actually recommend checking out the Vimeo channel because the video quality is a little bit better and it's better organized, and there you can see the tutorials for both Studio, Maxwell, and some different plugins, especially Cinema 4D. We have a big tutorial series for that. And also, of course, the documentation. So please check out the documentation because it's really very thorough and it helps. It helps a lot.
Well, great. That's very useful. Well, thank you so much, Mihai. I'm going to make myself the presenter. Sorry to take the screen back.
Oh.
It's not going to be as colorful or pleasing, but it's okay. And I'll conclude this webinar thanking everybody for attending. Thank you from the Novedge team. I want to remind you all to visit our page at novedge.com and check out Maxwell Render V3 And if you buy before December 19th, you can save up almost $200. Check it out. It's 25% discount. For information on the latest specials and new releases, join the Novedge network on Facebook, Google+, or Twitter, and subscribe to the Novedge blog. I want to remind you that our upcoming webinar will be with killer renderings tips for V-Ray and Rhino. V-Ray and Rhino users, you don't want to miss this one. To rewatch today's webinar or previous ones, check out the Novedge YouTube or Vimeo channels. Our webinar playlist has webinars for every software taste. Thanks again for joining us and have a wonderful day. Thank you so much, Mihai. Thank you for your thoroughness, and I know you gave it 100%, and it looks great. I know what I'm doing tonight. Okay. I'll practice at home. Okay,
right,
thank you so much.
Send us your renders.
Yes. Thank you so much, everybody, and see you at the next webinar. Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye-bye.